Last week in reading, we talked about character traits, which describes a character's personality or how they behave most of the time. And we said this is different from a character's emotions or feelings because those can change very quickly. So, like a character might be really happy that they got to get their favorite ice cream flavor, but then get sad when they drop it on the floor the next minute. So, a character's feelings can change very quickly, but their traits are going to stay the same, usually throughout the story. And we also talked about how those character traits can affect how a character responds to problems in a story. So we've become really familiar with Frog and Toad, and we're going to continue studying them because we can learn a lot more about characters in a series than characters that are in just a single standalone book. When you're reading about characters in a series, you're able to look at how they respond to a lot of different problems because there's more stories to look at. And the more stories you're able to read about them, the more evidence you're able to gather about their character traits. And you should be able to notice some patterns. So with Frog and Toad, we've already been noticing some patterns. We've seen that Frog is usually pretty friendly and he's more responsible and helpful compared to Toad. And while Toad is also can be friendly, in the story the Lost Button, he gave that nice jacket to Frog. So we're not saying he's not friendly, but he has given more of an impression of being lazy, a little bit irresponsible. He tends to whine when things aren't going his way. So these are the character traits we've already noticed about Frog and Toad, and we want to keep those in mind as we read more Frog and Toad stories. Today, as we're reading some Frog and Toad stories, we're going to stop and jot. And we did this when we were in school. And even if you don't have sticky notes at home, you can just write it on paper. I'm actually going to be writing on sticky notes on the computer. And I'm going to stop and jot as we're reading a story to see what are some things that Frog and Toad are doing in the story that provide more evidence for these character traits we've already thought of them. And we might even come up with some more character traits to describe them. But we want to always have evidence for why we think these characters have these traits. So let's go ahead and read another Frog and Toad story. This story is called Spring. Frog ran up the path to Toad's house. He knocked on the front door. There was no answer. Toad, Toad, shouted Frog. Wake up! It is spring. Blah, said a voice from inside the house. Toad, Toad, cried Frog. The sun is shining. The snow is melting. Wake up! I am not here, said the voice. Frog walked into the house. It was dark. All the shutters were closed. Toad, where are you? Called Frog. Go away, said the voice from a corner of the room. Toad was lying in bed. He had pulled all the covers over his head. Frog pushed Toad out of bed. He pushed him out of the house and onto the front porch. Toad blinked in the bright sun. Help, said Toad. I cannot see anything. All right, we're going to go ahead and pause here since I'm already noticing some things that Frog and Toad are doing that support some of the character traits we had already come up with for them. So, for one thing, I'm noticing that Toad does not want to get out of bed. So I'm going to write Toad does not want to get out of bed. And this shows that he's kind of lazy, which we had talked about before. This shows that he is a little lazy. Now with Frog, I've noticed that he's really excited for spring and he's trying to get Toad excited too. And this reminds me of that word we talked about last week, being optimistic. That means being really positive and seeing the good in every situation. So Frog is really excited about spring and tries to get Toad excited too. This shows that he is optimistic. All right, let's keep reading and see what else we can learn about them. Don't be silly, said Frog. What you see is the clear, warm light of April, and it means that we can begin a whole new year together, Toad. Think of it, said Frog. We will skip through the meadows and run through the woods and swim in the river. In the evenings, we'll sit right here on this front porch and count the stars. You can count them, Frog, said Toad. I will be too tired. I am going back to bed. So again, being a little lazy. I'm also thinking this kind of also shows what we talked about him being a little bit whiny. So I might add that too. So Toad keeps complaining. This shows that he can be whiny, so he complains a lot. Toad went back into the house. He got into the bed and pulled the covers over his head again. But Toad, cried Frog, you will miss all the fun. Listen, Frog, said Toad. How long have I been asleep? You have been asleep since November, said Frog. Well then, said Toad, a little more sleep will not hurt me. Come back again and wake me up at about 1/2 May. Good night, Frog. But Toad, said Frog, I will be lonely until then. Toad did not answer. He had fallen asleep. Frog looked at Toad's calendar. The November page was still on top. Frog tore off the November page. He tore off the December page, and the January page, and the February page, and the March page. He came to the April page. Frog tore off the April page too. Now remember, it is April when he's doing this. Then Frog ran back to Toad's bed. Toad, Toad, wake up! It is May now. What? Said Toad. Can it be May so soon? Yes, said Frog. Look at your calendar. Toad looked at the calendar. The May page was on the top. Why, it is May, said Toad as he climbed out of bed. Then he and Frog ran outside to see how the world was looking in the spring. All right, so the way the story ended is making me actually think of a new character trait that I think Frog might have. Because what he's doing here is that he's tricking Toad, who is his friend. And I'm remembering in the story we read last week, the hat, he also tricked Toad in that story, where he shrunk Toad's hat with water, but lied to him and told him that it was his brain, I think, or his head getting bigger. Even though I think both these times, Frog is trying to be a good friend and he's not trying to be mean to Toad, he is still being dishonest with him and he is tricking him. And a word this makes me think of is the word manipulative. That word manipulative describes someone or a character who tries to kind of trick other people to get them to do what they want, because that's exactly what Frog is doing here. Frog is tricks Toad into believing it is May so that Toad will spend time with him because he doesn't want to be lonely. This makes me think Frog can be, it's a long word now, manipulative. And I'm also thinking of a new character trait for Toad. So Toad is really quick to believe these tricks that Frog is playing on him. And that makes me think of another word, which is gullible. Gullible describes someone or a character who believes things really easily. I don't know if anyone's ever played the joke on you where they say, look, gullible's written on the ceiling, and you look up, and they're like, oh, you're gullible. Gullible is someone who believes things really quickly, even if it doesn't make the most sense. Like when Frog told Toad that his hat was fitting because his head had gotten bigger. That doesn't really make sense. But Toad, I guess, is a little bit gullible and believes things, and he's just really trusting of Frog. So Toad is quick to believe that it is May when Frog is tricking him. This makes me think Toad is gullible. All right, so these are some things I'll add to our character trait chart. For your activity today, you're going to be listening to another Frog and Toad story, and you're going to be doing the same thing that we just did with this story. As you're listening, I want you to pause the video and stop and jot. So on a piece of paper, just like I did, jot some of the things that you're noticing Frog and Toad are saying or doing in the story that show evidence for some of the character traits you've already noticed, or maybe, like we just did, notice some new character traits. But I want you to give evidence and say what character trait it's doing. Just like I would say, like, okay, Toad is quick to believe this trick. That makes me think he's gullible. Frog is tricking Toad. That makes me think he's manipulative. So give me the evidence and then let me know what character trait it's making you think that character has. On the instructions, there is an exact number for you to come up with. How about we aim for, though, maybe 2 per character? I don't think that's too much. 2 character traits per character that you can give me some evidence for from the story. You got this.